Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second of the week's lectures on traditional medicine in modern Africa. If you'll recall, last time in class we talked about the concept of invented traditions, and after that we had an opportunity to discuss the extent to which this concept can be applied to medical history. There are lots and lots of scholars who have tried to do this over the years, and collectively, their work looks at how both doctors and sometimes governmental officials invoke tradition to advance their professional and political interests. As these scholars have noted, when people call themselves traditional healers, they're using this label because they believe it enhances their legitimacy and credibility. Hence, the label traditional taps into a widely shared belief that traditions are authentic, pure, and highly desirable. Tradition has a positive connotation here. It signifies something of great worth and value. Unlike the situation in the West, where, since the Enlightenment, tradition has assumed a generally negative meaning, in many non-Western contexts, the idea of tradition as a set of customs that's been handed down unchanged from one generation to the next over an immense span of time has great appeal. And it is for this reason that so many medical practitioners, again, along with many governments, have started attaching this word to the forms of healing they practice and promote. Healers who call themselves traditional argue that their practices have not changed over time, but instead reflect the practices of their ancestors. And they argue this because they know it benefits them, personally, socially, and professionally. But are their practices really traditional? Or might they be more accurately termed invented traditions? And if so, when and why did these invented traditions emerge? Keeping our focus on South Africa, in today's lecture we're going to look at the history of that country's system of traditional medicine and see where it came from and why it's become such a big part of the country's medical marketplace today. Along the way, we'll have an opportunity to see what traditional medicine really means in the South African context and to see how applicable the concept of invented traditions is here. The story that I want to tell here begins in the 1930s, and it unfolds in the South African province of Natal, which, like the rest of South Africa, was at the time an independent country under white rule. The central character of our story is a South African man named Mafavuke Nikobo, a native medical practitioner whose main base of operations was in the city of Durban. During the first few decades of the 20th century, Durban was a magnet for migration, as thousands of rural South Africans flocked here. Among those who relocated to this growing coastal city were healers, specifically herbalists, whose practices white rulers had only recently legalized. For much of the 19th century, indigenous medicine had been outlawed in South Africa, but in 1891, the British changed course, creating a licensing system that gave herbalists, who were called Inyangas in the local Zulu language, the right to earn a livelihood as doctors. In response to this, lots of Inyangas secured government licenses and moved to urban locations like Durban, a city whose swelling, diverse population offered tons of prospective patients, both black and white. After setting up shop in cities like Durban, Natal's native Inyangas began advertising their services in a number of different ways. Some distributed pamphlets. Others published announcements in local papers. So as to make themselves more popular to their multiracial clientele, many taught themselves the theory and practice of biomedicine, finding employment in the offices and shops of Durban's white physicians, and while there acquiring a basic working knowledge of Western medical concepts and cures. After these quasi-apprenticeships, they began marketing themselves as doctors of native medical science, filling their shops with goods and supplies and symbols from all across the world. Some sold Western chemist supplies and biomedicines on the side. Others mixed prescriptions for European drugs on site. All of this was offered along with native herbal preparations, and because they catered to the needs of both native Africans and white colonial settlers, some of these Inyangas became quite wealthy. Capable of catering to the medical needs of a broad swath of the South African population, these herbalists were well positioned to dominate the local medical marketplace. Among their number was Mafavuke Nikobo. By the 1920s, he had not only his own herbal practice, but also 5 pharmacy shops that he owned. Like many of his fellow Inyangas, Nikobo sold both indigenous remedies and a variety of European drugs, and he was quite successful. Nikobo called himself a native medical scientist, and in 1928 he helped form the Native Natal Medical Association, a professional group designed to help Inyangas advance their collective and individual interests. All of this worried South Africa's white doctors. The popularity of the Inyangas was not something the white medical establishment had predicted or prepared for, and as doctors like Nikobo succeeded in attracting more and more patients, Natal's white doctors fought back. Particularly worrying to them was the fact that many white patients, for various reasons, were choosing the Inyangas over them. In the 1920s, by which time the number of licensed African herbalists in Natal grew to around 2,100, the province's white doctors began to clamor for legal restrictions against the Inyangas. As you can see from the quote on the slide here, their goal was to convince South Africa's leaders to restrict the Inyangas' practices to black patients and native remedies. In making their arguments, white doctors consciously played on racial anxieties, contending that if the Inyangas retained the ability to use Western medicine and to treat white patients, one day, in the not-too-distant future, black South Africans would come to see themselves as equals of white South Africans and rise up against them. In response to these lobbying efforts, in 1928, South African legislatures passed the Medical, Dental, and Pharmacy Act. The white medical establishment got what it wanted. Native medical practice was once again banned, and the licensing system Inyangas had relied on was ended. Over the course of the 1930s and 40s, the number of Inyangas practicing in Durban dropped to just a handful. Subsequent laws prevented them from using so-called European medicines, from accepting white patients, and from using the title doctor. Among those caught up in the snares of the new legislation was Mafavuke Nikobo. In 1940, Nikobo was formally charged with violating the 1928 Act and brought to court for a trial. In court, his accusers alleged that Nikobo had violated a law stating that Inyangas could sell only native medicines. When asked what a native medicine was exactly, they proclaimed that this referred to drugs whose ingredients one obtained by digging up African soil. In response to this, Nikobo's legal team skillfully pointed out that many supposedly native medicines, in fact, had foreign origins. They also pointed out that many so-called European medicines made use of locally obtained ingredients. Despite the soundness of this reasoning, the presiding justice rejected the defense's points. On appeal, a second judge upheld the original decision, arguing that native medicine meant, quote, as he put it, medicines such as natives can make for themselves by comparatively simple processes, not requiring a high degree of scientific skill, out of the natural substances of the country which are available to them. In the end, Nikobo lost his license and was fined 25 British pounds, a rather hefty sum by 1940 standards. The case of Mafavuke Nikobo helps us see what traditional medicine meant in early 20th century South Africa. As we can see from the legal proceedings, traditional medicine was said to be simple and unscientific. It was also said to be static, unchanging, and fixed in the past. While Nikobo's career actually shows that African medicine was incredibly dynamic and multicultural, in the courtroom, white doctors and their allies created a false binary between African and Western medicine, in which only the latter was said to be innovative and adaptable. The label traditional medicine became a way for them to counter the commercial threat Inyangas like Nikobo posed to their therapeutic livelihoods. In enabling white doctors to remain professionally viable within South Africa, the label traditional helped uphold white rule. This was true of Africa more generally as well. During the colonial period, European administrators and anthropologists used the word tradition as a means of contrasting the societies of the colonizers and the colonized. African culture, so the argument went, was timeless, primitive, and stagnant. Africa was a place whose traditions were inferior to the modernizing, dynamic, innovative culture of the West. Finding African tradition served the colonialist goal of depicting a false binary between Africa and the West, one that perpetuated racist stereotypes and gave the West permission to rule over the continent. As historians have come to learn, many of the country's traditions were invented by Europeans so as to facilitate their conquest and control of African peoples. But the story does not end here. Despite the setbacks Inyangas like Nikobo met with, they did not give up. Shortly after the Natal Native Medical Association was founded, its members began lobbying the government to give it a monopoly over what it called the native curative system. In their publications and formal meetings, they broadcast the message that only African doctors should treat African patients. Just like white doctors had prohibited them from using Western medicine or treating white patients, they sought to prohibit white doctors from selling African medicines or consulting with African patients. In support of these efforts, Nikobo himself issued a flyer stating that he was, quote, a person who has acquaintance, knowledge, and experience about various diseases of Bantu people, and is a native himself. I declare to all the Bantu people of South Africa that I possess medicine for all parts of the body and doctoring to all diseases that trouble a native, starting from a baby up to an aged woman and her aged husband. The medicines are specially prepared for native troubles, customs, and nature. As this passage makes clear, whereas white doctors had derided native medical remedies and techniques, the Inyangas reappropriated them in a much more positive way, using tradition to demonstrate their superior knowledge of the kinds of conditions that black bodies suffered from and the kinds of treatments that black bodies required. It was within this context of racism, professional competition, and struggles for authority that the idea of African traditional medicine was born. In the hands of the Inyangas, African traditions were presented not as inferior, backward, primitive, uncivilized, or barbaric, but instead as wholesome, holistic, spiritual, authentic, and humane, a welcome alternative to biomedicine whose benefits it far surpassed. And that is the understanding of traditional medicine that has persisted down to the present. All right, that's all we've got for today. For our next meeting, we'll look at the contemporary period, focusing on an article that talks about circumcision as an invented African medical intervention in the context of the HIV/AIDS crisis. Please read the article and see the questions I've sent out about this, and once you've read through it, you can head over to the discussion forum and share your thoughts. I look forward to seeing you there. Bye-bye for now.